Hey guys, we are going to be on our autonomic nervous system today. So we're going to be talking about the autonomic nervous system is our sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So generally that's going to be like fight, flight, or freeze versus our rest and digest. We're going to describe the components. We're going to differentiate between those different structures. We're going to compare and contrast the autonomic reflex to that of the somatic reflex. The somatic reflexes are the ones that we talked about in chapter 14. We're going to predict the response of a target effector to those autonomic input on the basis of the release signaling molecule. And then we're going to describe how the central nervous system coordinates and contributes to the autonomic. So hopefully you kind of recognize this general idea, right? So we have that central nervous system. The central nervous system is our brain and our spinal cord. The central nervous system is connected in with the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is going to be our cranial nerves and our spinal nerves. Okay? And we have two different divisions here. We have our motor division and our sensory division. The motor division is going to be our efferent. So that's going to be where we're having those. It's also called the descending pathway because we're sending out that signal out to have some sort of effect on the rest of our body. Okay, so when we further divide that efferent division, we can have what's called the somatic motor and the visceral motor. So the somatic motor, that's the motor innervation of all of our skeletal muscles. That's where we're fully aware of what's going on. And then we have our visceral motor. And so that's going to be the smooth muscle, the cardiac muscle and glands. And it's also like the autonomic nervous system kind of idea that we've talked about before. Okay. So that visceral motor or autonomic nervous system is then further divided into the parasympathetic and the sympathetic division. That's what we're going to be talking about today. But just to review really quickly is that we also have our sensory division or our afferent or arriving pathway. It's also called the ascending pathway because the signal is going up to the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so we have the somatic sensory. So these are your five senses as well as hearing, equilibrium, and proprioception, vibration, pressure, pain, all that good stuff. And then our visceral sensory. So this is going to be like our stretch, pain, temperature changes with our viscera. So like nausea and hunger are going to be visceral sensory symptoms or systems. And then we have some special systems here as well, like taste and smell. Okay, so we're going to be sending that information up to our cranial nerve or central nervous system, our brain and spinal. So let's just review really quickly, like what is the ganglion? We talked about ganglion, I think, back in chapter 12 or 13. So ganglion is just a collection of the neuronal cell bodies that are found outside of the central nervous system. So typically as part of the peripheral nervous system, right? And so it's just those cell bodies. We also call those cell bodies the soma. So if you just imagine a neuron, so it's a collection of those neuronal cell bodies, okay? And so what happens is that we actually have some different sort of chain ganglion, okay? So here, this is a sympathetic chain ganglion right there. Okay. We can see that right there you have the central neuron is going to synapse with more superior, inferior ganglion, okay? So it's generally like a connection point, okay, is what's happening there. So our autonomic nervous system is that we can divide it into the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. This is a subdivision of our peripheral nervous system, and they are not under our conscious control. So this is sort of how our body is keeping us, our autonomic responses, right? So autonomic would be those things that your body does automatically, like heart rate, okay, blood pressure, pupil dilation, okay? And so the sympathetic part of that is going to be our fight, flight, or freeze, okay? Fight, flight, or freeze. And parasympathetic we sometimes call as rest and digest. So we actually have dual innervation here, so that allows them to maintain homeostasis, meaning that we have innervation going to our pupils from both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Okay. So as you know, in anatomy, we like to call things multiple terms. Same things, multiple terms. So we have the sympathetic nervous system. We also will sometimes refer to that as the thoracolumbar division, and that's because of our sympathetic ganglion right here coming out at the thoracic and the lumbar vertebrae. Okay. And then for the parasympathetic, we sometimes call it the craniosacral division, and that's because we have those nerves coming out here. Okay, so that innervation happening. for sympathetic, that's going to, just to give us a quick comparison, right, is that we have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And the anatomy is a little bit different. In the sympathetic case, the postganglionic fibers, that means that the ganglion, so I already talked about a ganglion, right? And so the fibers coming after the ganglion, those fibers tend to be pretty long. But whereas in the parasympathetic case, they're typically shorter. Right? The axons are highly branched. They influence many organs. However, in the parasympathetic case, that's our rest and digest. They have fewer branches, so they have a localized effect. And they actually release sort of different types of neurotransmitters. So in the case of sympathetic, we're going to release norepinephrine or acetylcholine. However, in the parasympathetic case, we're going to release acetylcholine. So here you go. You can see that. Okay. So in the case here, it also has to do with that receptor. Okay. So for sympathetic, we have a fight or flight. We're going to, and our preganglionic, it's going to release acetylcholine to a nicotinic receptor. Okay. But in the parasympathetic, it's going to release it here again to that acetylcholine to that nicotinic receptor. The thing is that it's different receptors, right? Because a localized effect happening for that parasympathetic response. Okay. And then also for sympathetic, we can release norepinephrine, and that's going to be to our alpha or a beta receptors. And then the postganglionic, okay, so again, that's the part after the ganglion. We have the acetylcholine is going to be binding to a muscarinic receptor, but those muscarinic receptors are going to be associated with our sweat glands and the blood vessels that are associated with our skeletal muscles only, whereas acetylcholine is going to bind to the muscarinic receptors in our parasympathetic nervous system. Here's another little diagram to kind of show you. So this is our sympathetic, our fight or flight, okay? And so you can see this is our preganglionic fiber, postganglionic, okay? Parasympathetic, preganglionic, postganglionic, and so you can see the difference in them, okay? And that they're going to sort of those effector cells, so, or effector organs, so it might be our smooth muscles, like in the case of a blood vessel, our glands to release a hormone perhaps, or to stop releasing, and then our cardiac muscle to change sort of our heart rate, for instance, okay? So as far as our fight or flight pathway, okay, so we have our sympathetic pathway here, okay? So here's that preganglionic fiber, okay? And we're going to release out that acetylcholine, and then that's going to cause the eventual release of norepinephrine from that postganglionic fiber. Okay, so the preganglionic fiber, it can release either the acetylcholine or it can release norepinephrine. Okay, the postganglionic fiber, once we get that acetylcholine, it can also release acetylcholine out for the muscarinic receptors or norepinephrine, as you can see. Okay. And then we have the parasympathetic pathway here. Okay. So there's that really long preganglionic fiber. Okay. Here it's happening right here into a smooth muscle, so it's going to release acetylcholine. So these, again, they work antagonistically because we have a dual innervation. And so the sympathetic response is to perhaps, that's for like a fight or flight situation. So that would be, oh, I'm being attacked by something, right? And if you're going to be attacked by something, I would say a lion, tiger, or a bear, oh my. If you're going to be attacked by a lion, tiger, or a bear, then you're probably going to notice some physiological responses. So if you just kind of close your eyes for a second and think about it, like what would happen if you were going to be attacked by a lion, a tiger, or a bear, right? So if, for instance, maybe your pupils were going to dilate so that you'd really be able to see that lion, tiger, or bear, so that you could see better, right? Your heart rate might increase. The force of the contraction of your heart, like, oh my gosh, my heart is pounding out of my chest. That would be a sympathetic response. You may see an increase of sweat. You might feel an increase of saliva in your mouth. Okay, your mouth is not going to feel dry. It's going to feel really moist. Okay. So our heart rate. So regions of our heart that establish that heart rate, they have a connection point with those postganglionic fibers from both of our systems. So if, for instance, norepinephrine is released into those cells, it's going to bind into an adrenergic receptor. That's going to cause our cells to depolarize faster, therefore increasing our heart rate. Okay, so that's going to be a cardio acceleratory rate, right? We're going to increase that heart rate. But if acetylcholine is released onto those same cells, it can actually bind to the muscarinic receptor. That can cause those cells to hyperpolarize. When that happens, they can't reach the threshold as easily, so our heart rate slows. This all continues to go back to those action potentials that we went over in the muscles, right, guys? So you have to know the action potentials. Are we depolarizing? If we're depolarizing, we can cause us to actually depolarize faster, meaning that we get closer to threshold. Or we can cause ourselves to hyperpolarize. Instead of sitting at our resting number of about negative 70, we can actually put us at negative 90. So that means it's going to take us longer to get to that threshold number. Therefore, our heart rate's going to slow. So without that parasympathetic input, the heart would work at a rate of 100 beats per minute. Woo, that's fast, okay? But what we do is that our sympathetic system can actually speed it up as it does during exercise, or our parasympathetic system can slow it down during our resting heart rate of about 60 to 80 beats per minute. So we have what are called autonomic varicosities. We talked about those, I believe, when we talked about our smooth muscle. Okay, so in autonomic varicosities, we have these varicosities sort of wrapping around our smooth muscles, okay, and they release their neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitter is going to bind into the neurotransmitter receptors along the sarcolemma of the smooth muscles, causing a depolarization. So the sympathetic response is fight, flight, or freeze, right? So in this case, we generally are going to receive that norepinephrine. And so that's going to cause us to have excitement. This is going to happen with the letter E. So exercise, excitement, emergency, embarrassment. So what happens to your body physiologically during those times? When you exercise, your respiratory rate increases, right? Also when you're excited, or if there's an emergency, or if you're embarrassed, okay? That's where hyperventilation sometimes happens during embarrassment, right? So we start to ventilate or have a higher respiratory rate. So we start to breathe faster, okay? We're also going to see our heart rate is going to increase. And then, like I said, we're going to have a higher contraction point, right? So we're going to beat the heart really hard. Hopefully you can hear my hands clapping, okay? So it's going to start beating faster and harder, heart pounding out of the chest, okay? We also, during embarrassment, what would you see with some people who have really pale skin is that their face might flush, right? Because we actually dilate the blood vessels along the air, along different regions of the body. And we also may see some increase of sweat, right? During exercise, we sweat. And your pupils may dilate, okay? So here's some things that we might see during our sympathetic response, okay? You might see an increase of our cardiac activity. We're going to increase our blood pressure, dilate our skeletal muscle blood vessels because we're basically getting ready to attack that lion, tiger, or bear, or we're already using those extra skeletal muscles. We can see a constriction of blood vessels within the skin, but not necessarily the skin of the face. We can see dilation of pupils. Those pupils are going to get larger. Okay. We're going to see an increase in our blood glucose and free fatty acid levels because we're going to be using those muscles. We're going to need that glucose and the free fatty acids to make more glucose if we run out of blood glucose, right? We're going to see a dilation of our bronchial smooth muscle. That's so they get more air in with each breath. Okay. We're going to see a secretion of our viscous saliva. Viscous saliva is just sort of help keep your mouth moist so you're not thirsty. We're going to start to see more sweating. We're also going to see a lower threshold for reticular formation activation that has to do with our kidneys. And then our liver is going to produce more glucose because we need more energy for our muscle contraction out of the glycogen that we stored there in our liver. In the parasympathetic case, this is rest and digest, like that little frog there is just hanging out. Okay, the typical neurotransmitter here is going to be acetylcholine. We talk about this with our D's. So we're digesting, we're defecating, that's pooping, and we're doing diuresis, which is peeing, urinating. Okay. So when the case of just sort of that hanging out time, right, we're going to have a decrease of our cardiac activity. So we're going to lower or slow down our heart rate. This is like during yoga. Just close your eyes, take a deep breath. We're going to have the secretion of some watery saliva. We're going to stimulate our GI secretions because we're really digesting that food. We're going to contract our urinary bladder, meaning that we can go to the bathroom when we need to. We're going to increase our insulin and glucagon secretion as needed. And we're going to constrict those bronchioles back down. Hopefully you guys are all relaxed now. Let's talk about the sympathetic ganglion. So the sympathetic ganglion, okay, right here. So they're innervating right here. Our eyes, our salivary glands, our hearts, and our lungs. We're going to see it at our liver, gallbladder, stomach, spleen, pancreas. See the large intestine, small intestines, kidneys, urinary bladder, penis and scrotum, or the ovaries. Okay. All right, there. So these are ganglionic neurons. They're going to be in the greenish color, and then the red color is going to be our pre-ganglionic neurons right there. So the site of the synapse is between our pre and post sympathetic ganglion. The sympathetic trunk ganglion are located from the base of the skull all the way to the coccyx. And then we also have prevertebral ganglia that are going to innervate our organs below the diaphragm. Our parasympathetic ganglion are the site of the synapses between the pre and the post parasympathetic ganglion. So we have what are called terminal ganglia. These are located close to or within the walls of our visceral organs, right? So they're coming in here, right? So remember we talked about craniosacral division, thoracolumbar region. Okay. For those autonomic reflexes, they actually have a two-step pathway. Okay, so for instance, we have our preganglionic fibers. Those preganglionic fibers are going to come from the lateral horn, and the postganglionic fiber are going to hit that target effector. So these are going to be from our internal senses, like our blood pressure, for instance, which has a baroreceptor. Okay, so here is our autonomic pathway here. So we're going to come here, preganglionic fiber from the lateral horn. Okay. And it's going to hit that target effector right there. Okay. Whereas in the case of our somatic pathway, okay, that we're going to hit here, look at the really long myelinated fiber there going all the way to the muscles, right? So this is that two-step, this is a single-step response. Okay, so look at those and just determine what's different about the somatic versus the visceral. This is visceral, this is somatic. So let's talk about the differences, right? So somatic's involving both an afferent and an efferent pathway, meaning that we have an arrival of a signal coming through and then we're sending a signal back out to our motor response, right? We also, in the autonomic case, it only involves an exiting signal or an efferent pathway. The somatic is voluntary activity, so locomotion. The effectors are our skeletal muscles. But in the autonomic response, it's not. It's all involuntary activities. For, let's see, what else? The somatic, the neuromuscular junctions are very specialized and specific, right? So they're hitting just those specific muscles that we want them to respond. But in the case of autonomic, we have the synapse at the target organ. And it can actually diffuse, remember those varicosities that we talked about. Okay. So referred pain, what is that exactly? So our visceral senses are not part of our conscious perception. However, they can become part of our conscious perception. I don't know about you guys, but I am not typically aware of my kidneys. Okay? Not really. However, if somebody's experiencing something like kidney stones, they typically complain of pain along their lower back, okay? And so the theory here is that we have visceral sensory fibers, right? And they actually are coming in at the same level of our spinal cord as our somatosensory fibers of the pain location. So if we start to have a heart attack, for instance, we might start to feel pain down the left arm. Okay. The liver and the gallbladder kind of hitting a little bit higher up in the back. The thymus we sometimes feel up at the top of the shoulder. The lungs and our diaphragm, we start to see it here up in the top of our neck. Okay. So pupil size. Pupil size is under autonomic control, right? And so we have that autonomic control of our pupillary size. If you guys have had a lab with me, then you've already seen this happen with lab. So what happens is that we activate this pupil size by the amount of light. Okay? And we do that using what are called our retinal ganglion cells. So our output of our sympathetic system projects through the ganglion, and then it projects to the iris. Okay, so we can either dilate the pupil or we can constrict the pupil. So dilate means to get bigger, constrict means to get smaller. So when we have dim light being perceived, okay, the sympathetic central neuron is going to stimulate within that cervical vertebrae. Okay. Then the central neuron is going to synapse with our superior cervical ganglion of that sympathetic chain. And then we're going to see a sympathetic postsynaptic neuron release of norepinephrine. When we see norepinephrine being released, it's going to stimulate the iris muscles to contract. Okay? When we contract the iris muscles, it makes the pupils bigger. Okay? Then, if we see bright light, okay, so maybe you shined a light in one of the pupils, okay, when you do that, we're going to activate that Edinger-Westphal nucleus of the midbrain, okay. Now remember that Edinger-Westphal nucleus of both sides are actually going to be activated when we see that bright light, even just in one eye. That's part of our pupil reflex. Okay. The central neuron is going to synapse with ciliary ganglion of the prevertebral ganglion. And then we're going to release norepinephrine, and it's going to release the, relax those iris muscles, okay? So even though we're doing the same norepinephrine, that's not relevant. What's relevant is which neuron is releasing the norepinephrine, okay? So you can't think of, oh, norepinephrine is always going to result in dilation, or acetylcholine is always going to result in constriction. That's not always the case, okay? So here's that pupil reflex that I was just talking about. So we shine the light into the right eye only. You can actually see that the light is going to, look at that. It's going to travel through both sides, and that's one of the reasons, because it's going to go through the optic chiasm right here, through those optic nerves. Okay, so we're going to then hit that preectal nucleus back here, right? And we're going to get an action potential from both sides. They're then going to stimulate both sides of that Edinger-Westphal nucleus, and that right and left sides of that Edinger-Westphal nuclei are going to generate action potentials, and it's going to cause both pupils to constrict. So our hypothalamus is actually the control center. It regulates our autonomic function and the endocrine function, and it helps to maintain homeostasis. The limbic lobe is going to contain the amygdala and the medulla. The amygdala is responsible for our emotions and our memory. You can see the amygdala right here. It's sort of that purpley color. And then the medulla is our cardiovascular center. So there's different types of drug effects, and it depends on the drug itself. So nicotine, you may remember that we talked about some nicotinic receptors. Nicotine is very prevalent for cardiovascular disease, and one of those reasons is because it stimulates both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of the nervous system. So most of the time that would cancel itself out, right? Because we have that dual innervation. So if I'm stimulating both, then it's going to cancel out. But unfortunately, what happens is that in cardiovascular tissue or your heart tissue, there's essentially no parasympathetic influence on our blood pressure. So because there's no parasympathetic response, no rest and digest and bring it back down to normal, it's going to alter our heart rate regularity, meaning that we're going to have maybe an increase of blood pressure happening. We also have what are called sympathomimetic drugs. They affect our sympathetic nervous system, and one of them is called phenylephrine. Phenylephrine is very similar. Maybe you've heard of Sudafed. Okay? So it's very similar to that medication Sudafed. And the phenylephrine is actually going to mimic the action of norepinephrine, and it can cause us to dilate the pupils. So also these parasympathetic mimetic drugs or anticholinergic drugs are going to affect our parasympathetic system. And these little berries here, they used to do, but I don't really think they're really prevalent anymore, but people used to eat the berries and sort of try to cause this response. But there are different ones, like for instance, atropine. Maybe you've heard of atropine. Atropine can actually block the acetylcholine receptors that can cause our eyes to dilate. Atropine is also used as a pain reliever, and that's because it actually blocks those acetylcholine receptors so that we're not able to receive the pain signal anymore. Okay. So this is just a really quick chart to show you some of those drug types, some of those examples, and then what the sympathetic effect might be, what the parasympathetic effect is, and then the overall result. Okay, so the anticholinergics means that it's not going to allow for that acetylcholine kind of binding to happen, and so when we do that, it increases our sympathetic tone. Okay, for the parasympathetic mimetic drugs, that is going to increase our parasympathetic tone. Sympatholytic drugs, which would be like beta blockers, you may have heard of those, they increase our parasympathetic tone, so that means that they like decrease our heart rate. Okay, like these would decrease our heart rate, right? Whereas these would increase our heart rate. Let's see here. The nicotinic agonists, I already talked about nicotine, and then the phenylephrine is going to increase our sympathetic tone. So make sure that you can do this and just sort of review. If you have any questions, please let me know. I am happy to help you.